The protagonist ran through the slums of Hong Kong, trying to remain unnoticed. However, his strength quickly faded, and he stopped by a wall to rest. Although he felt relatively safe at that moment, he understood that his missions were becoming increasingly difficult with each attempt. Of course, the payment was more than generous, but it required risking his life. Some time had passed since he first arrived in this city, his task being to steal critical information for the intermediary he worked with. Nevertheless, even for such situations, he had a special plan prepared, allowing him to escape by triggering a small explosion near his pursuers. It was a dangerous move, but the most important thing was the payment for the job, which he was to receive shortly after submitting his mission report. The client was thoroughly satisfied with what the young man had accomplished and praised him as one of the best operatives, always living up to expectations despite all the difficulties. From a member of one of the most elite hacker organizations, such was expected, and he had to meet that standard. With the outbreak of the information war, the creation of such groups had become a necessity to defend against rival hackers. Some handled the challenges better than others, but only one stood at the very top. VX, the master hacker, unrivaled in skill and ability. The protagonist aimed to achieve similar results, working diligently in this field, and had even joined the group led by the strongest of all. However, at this moment he worried about his safety, as he had narrowly escaped capture. It seemed he had executed each step of the mission flawlessly, yet where he had erred remained unclear. Still, he received the money for completing the mission rather quickly, which put him somewhat at ease. This was one of the intermediary's greatest traits. Payment was always fair and never delayed after a successful mission. But suddenly, the hacker's computer screen began displaying interference, something that could only have been caused by a virus, though he had installed excellent security to prevent such incidents. The young man immediately realized that the intermediary was responsible, as only he had the means to execute such an attack. Moreover, the money sent for the job was returned to the sender's account. Shortly after, his computer system recovered, the attack subsided. Yet the intermediary continued to mock him, feigning concern over the consequences the hacker would now have to deal with. He had to address the issue immediately, as another breach could occur at any moment. The message contained a strange link, and the intermediary insisted that the young man open it. Despite the obvious danger, the protagonist complied. A map appeared, marked with several points, one of which indicated his current location. He was in his server room at the time, and the situation filled him with dread. To cover his tracks, the young man immediately destroyed all of his equipment, hoping that this would protect him from being discovered by his enemies. He didn't know what his opponent might do next, so he intended to erase everything that could possibly remain of him in the building, ensuring no one could find his data. Suddenly, the people who had been chasing him arrived, and there was no time left to think. In a desperate move, he set fire to his hideout and walked away, hoping to hide his face under a cap. The building was surrounded by those intending to capture the hacker, believing he was unaware of being tracked and confident they could ambush him. At that very moment, the protagonist was trying to slip away unnoticed and succeeded only because the pursuers were distracted by new information regarding a different suspect, allowing them to lose focus and miss the chance to catch him. The young man realized how close he had come to being caught, and thus hurried to escape as quickly as possible. He understood that the false information had been sent by the intermediary who had betrayed him. It was puzzling. This same intermediary had nearly caused his death, but had ultimately saved him. The protagonist now harbored thoughts of revenge against the traitor, unsure if he would truly go through with it. The building then exploded, erasing all the remaining data for good. It became clear that this too had been orchestrated by the traitor, though for reasons unknown. In an attempt to finally end the conversation, the young man smashed his own phone. He had heard stories of how operatives were often used and then discarded, but he never believed it would happen to him, given his former value as an employee. The young man knew he couldn't return to his group just yet, fearing he would be a disappointment to the greatest hacker and needing more time. A year later, he worked in a small cafe in the nation's capital, concealing his identity. The protagonist, having left his past life and work behind, now served coffee and desserts to customers, earning just enough to get by. He was polite and well-liked by the guests due to his attractive appearance, and many came to the cafe just to see him. Despite this, he felt deeply depressed, even when receiving compliments from beautiful women. His somber thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the cafe owner, who had been hiding behind the curtain in the storeroom, seemingly avoiding the customers on purpose. The young man was now known as Jinkan, the name he adopted after his escape to conceal his true identity. The cafe owner merely wanted to express his delight in having such a talented employee, crediting Jin for the increased number of visitors. Though, in truth, he wasn't always this reliable. During his first days, the young man constantly spilled coffee and broke dishes due to his clumsiness. After a lengthy period of praise, the owner made a rather awkward request, as if all the previous words had been leading up to this moment. He asked Jinkan to cover the night shift, as the person scheduled for that day had failed to show up once again. That employee had long deserved to be fired, as he frequently skipped work and contributed nothing of value to the establishment. However, the owner had been reluctant to do so because of the worker's family's dire financial situation, which, though generous, wasn't fair to the other employees. Nevertheless, the owner begged his best worker for help, even promising to assist with the customers himself, leaving only minor tasks for Jin to handle. Realizing he had little choice, Jinkang agreed, receiving thanks in return, though he asked that the gratitude be financial rather than verbal. The owner then recalled how, on their first day of meeting, he had immediately sensed that Jin was in a difficult life situation. Back then, Jin's gaze alone would terrify anyone who tried to order coffee, and the cafe had even lost some of its popularity when he was first hired. In fact, that had been true. Over time, the former hacker had learned much, including how to express emotions without frightening others. Now, even Jin Kang himself could scarcely believe that nearly a year had passed since the day he had lost everything and had no idea where to turn. At that time, he had hastily gotten into a taxi and driven off without a destination, with no goal, no place to stay, and no understanding of what to do next. He felt anger, resentment, and, in the end, all of it culminated in a crushing sense of helplessness, as everything had fallen apart so suddenly. In that moment, he realized he was utterly alone, and it was unlikely that anyone in the hacker group would be concerned about him, as he had disappeared without even sending in a mission report. Though, in reality, some of them might have been worried by such a strange situation, the best hacker likely wouldn't even notice his absence. He was faced with a difficult choice. He could walk away from the hacking world altogether, avoiding any reminder of his former life. However, he also had the option to continue fighting, to track down the one who betrayed him and finally exact revenge on that vile person. At that moment, Jin Kang realized he couldn't give up so easily. He had to bring down his enemy, destroying his life as a hacker forever. So, he returned to the country as quickly as possible and immediately found a part-time job to support himself until he could locate his foe. Now, he was on good terms with his boss and could freely ask for a raise, unafraid of being fired. Suddenly, a new customer entered the cafe, someone who hadn't been there before, with a striking and attractive appearance. The stranger immediately asked to place an order, prompting the owner to leave and allow his employee to work. The man ordered the simplest coffee drink and decided to stay inside the cafe, though something about him seemed unusual. He went to pay by card, but for a brief moment it seemed as though he was deliberately hesitant, holding onto it too firmly. The man then casually remarked on Jin Kang's interaction with his boss, which, though it sounded like small talk, felt oddly out of place. Finally, the customer handed over the card to Jin to complete the payment, took his receipt, and sat down, waiting for his order. The young man was irritated by the man's behavior, his expression growing darker, which did not go unnoticed by his boss. The cafe owner advised him to forget about the incident and calmly continue his work, so as not to scare the other customers. Meanwhile, the mysterious guest made a mental note that the employee, though seemingly detached, had a certain charm about him, though that was none of his concern. The cafe owner finally put up a notice seeking a new employee for the night shift, and promptly shared the news with his best worker. Yet this brought little joy to Jin Kang, who was utterly exhausted, having worked for hours on end without a break. Despite promises that he wouldn't have too many responsibilities, he still had to oversee the main tasks. The reason was the overwhelming number of customers. A good sign for the cafe, but exhausting for the staff. Today's earnings had tripled, which was odd, as they hadn't done anything out of the ordinary. The young man was frustrated, as he had to postpone his evening plans. He was at work instead of finishing his program, which was almost ready for testing. The boss tried to find some silver lining for the protagonist, mentioning that the person who had piqued his interest earlier was still in the cafe, giving him a chance to observe. The man had been working on his computer the entire time, completely focused and oblivious to his surroundings. Yet it was clear that every piece of his clothing was expensive. The cafe owner, well versed in fashion brands, could estimate the cost of each item the man was wearing. The cafe had never been so crowded since its opening, which was surprising, as there was no special event that day. The staff speculated that there might be a nearby event, but soon they learned the truth. One of the female customers was on the phone with a friend at the counter, gushing about the handsome man sitting in the cafe and recommending her friend come for coffee just to see him. Now it was clear. The mysterious customer had drawn the crowd, making the workday far more challenging, and it was obvious who to blame. It wasn't surprising given that most of the guests were women. In hindsight, they should have figured it out sooner. Late that night, Jinkan returned to his modest apartment, collapsing onto the bed, utterly drained and unable to move, as the day had been particularly grueling. He had not only been making coffee all day, but also cleaning the floors, washing dishes, and handling countless other tasks alone. So many people had come just to catch a glimpse of one man, and though he was admittedly handsome, it all seemed a bit too absurd. Jin began to notice that his thoughts about this man were becoming unusual, so he quickly distracted himself from such embarrassing reflections by focusing on more important matters. Not wanting to waste any time, he pulled out his laptop from his bag and logged into the system to continue working on his program. He couldn't forget that his primary goal was vengeance against the one who had ruined his life with a single act. Through reliable sources, he tried to gather information about the people he once worked with, but he hadn't been able to find anything. Everyone said that the group had simply vanished on the same day the protagonist was forced to go into hiding. He now believed that he had let everyone down with his carelessness, including the strongest hacker who also couldn't operate as usual. This realization only deepened his resolve to exact revenge as soon as possible, so they could all return to their normal lives. It was time to test the system Jinkan had been developing for the past year, which he had named Snickers, a program with several unique functions. Originally designed to protect data, it had evolved to serve other purposes, including hacking into foreign systems. Now the protagonist could infiltrate any server and find the necessary information wherever it was hidden. However, the most important feature was that it prevented anyone from tracking his location, something he desperately needed after everything that had happened. Strangely enough, the one person he most wanted to hide from was VX, as he needed time before returning to their shared mission. It was still too soon. For now, all he had to focus on was finding the one who betrayed him and neutralizing him, or better yet, avenging the damage that had been done. To track down his enemy, he studied a variety of resources, including maps and surveillance cameras. But unfortunately, nothing had yielded results yet. On one occasion, he himself was nearly found. He suspected it might have been his team leader, but he managed to evade detection thanks to the knowledge he had gained from years of working together. However, next time, it might not be so easy, which meant he needed to prevent such an incident from happening again. The young man was terrified by the talents of his former leader, understanding that he still had no idea what to expect from him, but he wasn't ready to reach out just yet. When all of this was finally over, he would return to his team, ready to beg for their forgiveness and for them to take him back. The next day at work, the protagonist looked grim, forced to down energy drinks just to keep himself from falling asleep on the spot. Of course, his boss noticed and was worried about him, knowing that he was partly to blame but not expecting things to get this bad. In truth, Jin Kang hadn't slept for several days, working relentlessly on his plan for revenge, though he couldn't possibly share the real reason for his exhaustion. When he was this close to catching the traitor, it was hard to sleep, knowing that every minute could be spent on something more important. He could already imagine the satisfaction of finally finding the scoundrel and making him realize that ruining someone's life for fun wasn't worth it. The cafe owner was concerned for Jin's well-being. He didn't want his employees to overwork themselves. But once again, the cafe was swamped with customers. Naturally, the owner was pleased, knowing that the day's profits would be massive. The reason for this crowd was the same unusual customer, who had returned to work at his usual table, drawing attention once again. He had even gained a nickname, as no one knew his real name. Surprisingly, a young man approached him today, though before it had mostly been women, and offered him a cup of coffee as a gesture. Everyone was curious to see if the man would accept the gift or refuse, as such a forward approach seemed a bit pushy. So far, no one had managed to catch his interest, despite various people attempting to strike up conversations, leaving it unclear whether he was even attracted to men or women. Suddenly, the stranger locked eyes with Jin Kang, despite the distance between them, and the moment was noticeable enough to cause some tension. Jin Kang felt a little unnerved, unsure why a stranger would stare at him so oddly, almost as if he already knew him. A minute later, the man touched the cup of coffee and, accidentally, knocked it over, spilling the drink onto the floor. This was no accident. His body language and expression made it clear that he had done it deliberately. The cafe owner panicked, worried that the coffee would stain the light tiles if not cleaned immediately, which would lead to costly damage. Jinkan, however, remained calm, quietly beginning to clean up, though he had no desire to approach the customer after that unnerving glance. The most unsettling part was knowing the spill wasn't accidental, as if someone was purposefully forcing him to mop the floor. As Jin dealt with the aftermath of the incident, he pondered the man's motives, realizing that perhaps he wasn't interested in men at all and had acted this way to rebuff the boy's advances. Meanwhile, the customer meticulously wiped the area around his laptop, paying no attention to anything else, while Jin Kang found himself watching him too intently. Realizing his stare had been noticed, Jin felt a wave of embarrassment, aware that he had been too curious about someone else's life, which wasn't his business. The stranger then apologized for making Jin clean up, insisting that it had been an accident. He explained that he had simply wanted to return the coffee to the person who had bought it, but accidentally knocked it over, causing the awkward situation. Watching the man speak, Jin Kang couldn't stay angry and decided to chalk it up to a simple mistake, admitting that the customer wasn't at fault. The man even offered to help, trying to politely fix the situation, but it wasn't necessary, as Jin had already finished cleaning. The customer then ordered more coffee, wanting to support the cafe where he had been treated so kindly. Naturally, Jin Kang quickly prepared the drink, and his opinion of the man who had recently started frequenting the cafe shifted completely. He regretted jumping to conclusions earlier and judging someone who turned out to be a polite and decent person. Jin Kang, like a guilty puppy, found himself looking at the man with a soft expression, feeling ashamed of his earlier assumptions. Not wanting to dwell on it, Jin returned to serving customers, as he was now working alone. The owner had left on errands and couldn't help anymore. Soon, another crowd gathered, eager to buy coffee, and it was shaping up to be just as tough a shift as the last. However, one of the women in the crowd was familiar to him, as she came for coffee almost every day after work. She looked tired, and Jin thought it was probably due to a similarly grueling shift, much like the ones he had been enduring lately. But in truth, her exhaustion wasn't from work. She was worried about her son, who had been acting very strangely lately. He had been trying to break into a hacker network, something that required making a bold statement, so he and his friends had been working on some program for a long time. During this time, he hardly left his room, which worried his mother, though it turned out this wasn't even the worst part. Recently, for reasons she didn't understand, the boy finally left his room, disconnected all internet connections, and asked if they could move away. From a few phrases the woman said, Jin Kang quickly pieced together the situation. Her son had tried to hack something but hadn't been careful enough and got hacked in return. Most likely, he had used an outdated, simple code, one that no one used anymore because of its high risk. If that were the case, cutting the internet connection had probably been the boy's only smart move, though even that might not save him. Jin typically avoided getting involved in such situations, but he couldn't help but try to calm the woman down. He advised her to go home early and spend time with her son, reassuring her that it would help ease his frustration over his failure. Her mood brightened instantly, as not only Jin but her co-workers had also supported her during this difficult time. Jin Kang remembered how understanding this woman had been when he made mistakes early on in his job, so he decided to help her son in return. That evening, instead of taking his usual route home, he detoured to her house to see if he could discreetly fix the problem without being noticed. That evening, the woman calmly read messages from the delivery service, which unfortunately couldn't bring the item she had purchased earlier. Noticing that her food was nearly burnt, she decided to focus solely on cooking for the moment, leaving her phone on the table. Meanwhile, the protagonist, who had stopped by their window with his laptop, managed to hack into her device using his program. Though he didn't want to invade her personal life, there was no internet connection in the house, making this the only option. To contact the rookie hacker anonymously, the only method left was using the basic messaging network on the device. He asked the boy a crucial question about his failed hacking attempt. It was vital to know who was after him to resolve the situation properly. Naturally, the boy was scared and reluctant to give out that information, fearing that this stranger could be hostile. There was no time to explain everything, so Jin Kang chose to apply pressure and threats, despite not wanting to harm the guest's son. He understood that hackers often thrive on a sense of superiority when breaching other systems, making it hard to believe that one of them might be trying to help. He justified this intervention by calling it boredom. After all, it had been a long time since he had worked on something substantial, and solving such a problem could be quite interesting. Finally, the novice hacker revealed his target, which shocked the protagonist, as the boy had picked a far too powerful opponent. Terran was a name every member of his old team knew. They were part of one of the most dangerous hacker groups and were considered highly ruthless. Though they lacked order within their own ranks, they had the backing of the mafia, which made Terran's brutality toward enemies even more intimidating. Even seasoned hackers avoided crossing paths with them, fearing either severe trouble or even being killed by their associates. Remembering how the boy's mother had described him, Jinkan couldn't believe the kid had been foolish enough to put his life in such danger. Despite thinking the boy's actions were reckless, Jinkan decided to help and reassure him. If nothing had happened yet, it was likely there was no immediate danger. This situation was beneficial for the protagonist too, as he realized his new program needed some real-world testing, so he deployed it on Terran's servers. Everything worked flawlessly. He was able to breach the group's stronghold effortlessly and browse their files without encountering any obstacles. However, once the hack was detected, a message appeared, arrogantly calling him an amateur trying to breach a serious server. That didn't concern him at the moment. He had come with a different goal, and there were more pressing matters to deal with. The group was located far enough away that it was relatively easy to identify the location they were monitoring in this country. The novice hacker had tried to hide by routing his activity through various servers, but that wouldn't help against such a serious adversary. They would track him down eventually. Jinkan quickly figured everything out, ensuring the rookie was no longer in danger. Luckily for him, he had found an experienced ally just in time. He was about to leave and warn the young hacker about what not to do until he learned the system, but then something went wrong. Someone else had interfered with his program, even though it was nearly impossible to do so, leaving Jinkan surprised. At first, he thought Terran had found him, but that wasn't the case. A large message appeared on his screen with someone attempting to uncover his identity. It was his former team. They had been searching for their missing comrade all year and had finally found a lead. Jinkan didn't understand what they wanted from him. There were no signs of an attack, nor any attempt to destroy his program. Seeing familiar words in the code, he realized who had interfered with his system. He had hoped this wouldn't happen, but he had been wrong. In any case, it was yet another sign that returning to a normal life was likely impossible, so the protagonist shut down the program, trying not to dwell on it. As soon as he finished, the young man, who had previously treated him with disdain, now became much more polite and grateful to his savior. After warning the rookie not to be so reckless, Jin decided to wrap things up and finally head home to continue his search for the traitor. He overheard a brief conversation between the cafe guest and her son, noting that the boy should be more polite, as if it hadn't been for her, Jin wouldn't have helped him. Soon, the news about Terran's breach spread online, and the nicknames given to the hackers of their system were far from flattering. But Jinkan tried to remain calm. It was clear that the hack had been orchestrated to provoke a conflict with the dangerous organization. Jinkan recalled how difficult it had been for him to return to his old craft at first. His hands would tremble, and he would be haunted by the memories of what had once happened. Fortunately, this time, everything had ended well, and he no longer had to worry about himself or the other participants in the incident. However, the strange customer continued to visit the cafe every day and, to Jin's frustration, kept spilling the coffee offered to him by those trying to impress him. Jinkan was tired of cleaning up after these incidents, but the man's polite demeanor made it hard to stay mad at him or express his irritation openly. Nonetheless, Jin suggested a better solution, refusing people verbally rather than being as blunt and rude as he had been. The man, however, wasn't used to handling such situations himself, as he had never had to do it before and could only show his rejection in a clumsy, abrupt manner. That's when Jinkan proposed a deal. He would refill the man's coffee every time it ran out, preventing others from trying to offer him drinks. While not profitable, Jin was simply too tired of constantly cleaning up spills. The man expressed his desire to talk to the protagonist and ask him a question, but Jin declined, saying there was nothing in it for him. Before the customer could argue, the cafe guest, the mother of the rookie hacker Jin had helped, arrived, bringing snacks to thank him for his helpful advice. Her son, who accompanied her, looked rather hostile, though he should have been more polite, especially considering he might need help again someday. It seemed that the pretext under which Jinkan had initially refused the unwanted conversation was taken a bit too literally by the man, Now he had something to offer in return. It felt quite strange, and the most sensible thing would have been to refuse both the gesture and the conversation. However, the contents of the package the man handed him were too tempting. A brand new phone, the latest model that had just hit the market. Now, Jin didn't want to reject the offer. He figured that since he only had to answer one question, there would be no harm in accepting the gift, so he took the package. He thought he could give the man the information he wanted right then and be done with it. But the man instead invited him to dinner to discuss everything there. The man mentioned that he had found a rather simple place, odd considering his appearance and attire, but this helped put the protagonist at ease. After work, Jinkan rode with the cafe guest in his car, an impressive model. Jin himself had wanted to buy a similar one back when he was making good money. For this man, it was no trouble to pay for it on pre-order, despite the hefty price tag he must have shelled out. Soon, they arrived at their destination, which turned out to be anything but simple. It was the bar of an upscale hotel, known for its excellent but exorbitantly priced alcohol. The protagonist didn't even want to step inside. He was shocked at where the man had brought him. However, by this point, refusing wasn't an option, even though Jin Kang was dressed far too casually for such a high-end establishment. The guests were greeted politely at the entrance and escorted to their table, which was in a small, private room separated by curtains. First, they introduced themselves, but it took quite some time for them to decide whether they should address each other formally or more casually. Jin Kang realized that communicating online with others was much easier for him. It was more comfortable to hack into someone's system than to decipher what someone else was thinking. The man was odd, almost playing games with Jin, subtly showing his superiority in either status or age. The protagonist wondered why he had been invited, but the man's response was vague and didn't offer much clarity. Jin Kang decided to ask directly if his companion was interested in him as a potential partner for something in the future. To his surprise, he was right. The man did, in fact, consider this meeting to be something of a date, and he didn't bother to hide his interest. The conversation unfolded much more calmly than Jin Kang had expected, almost as if he wasn't entirely opposed to such a relationship. The man assumed the best possible outcome for himself, thinking that perhaps Jin Kang had been considering something similar, in which case they could both be happy. Jin figured that Yeon, now he knew the man's name, likely gave this kind of attention to many people who caught his interest. However, it turned out that Jin Kang was the first person who had truly piqued his interest, despite the abundance of other options. The conversation was taking an uncomfortable turn, but fortunately, the waiter arrived to announce that their meals were ready, serving them alongside a bottle of wine.